The dog walked straight past the food bowl, past the warm blanket, past everything Caleb had set out for him, and stopped in front of the photograph on the wall. He stood there for 3 full seconds, completely still, and then he barked. Once. Sharp and clear and deliberate, the way a trained dog barks when it is trying to tell you something specific. Caleb felt the hair on his arm stand up. Because the photograph was 6 years old, and the German Shepherd in it, standing beside Caleb's father in full uniform, had amber eyes the exact same color as the dog now standing in his living room. Before we go any further, if stories about loyalty, truth, and the bonds that refuse to break even after years of silence mean something to you, hit subscribe and follow this one all the way through. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Caleb Hart almost didn't stop. That was the part that would stay with him later. The part he would turn over in his mind at 2 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. He had been 2 hours into a night patrol on Highway 9 when the headlights caught the shape on the median strip. Low and still, barely visible against the white. His first thought was debris. His second thought was a deer, injured and waiting to be put out of its suffering. He pulled over anyway. That was the job. You stopped. You checked. You didn't drive past something on the side of the road and tell yourself it was probably nothing. Because in 6 years of wearing a badge, Caleb had learned that probably nothing had a way of becoming something real and permanent and impossible to undo. He got out of the cruiser, and the cold hit him immediately, sharp and biting, the kind of Montana February cold that gets into your joints and stays there. He clicked on his flashlight and walked toward the median. The dog lifted his head. Caleb stopped walking. The animal was a German Shepherd, adult, large, his coat a pattern of deep black and tan gold that would have been striking if it hadn't been matted with ice and road grime and what looked like several days of exposure. His ribs were visible through the fur. His eyes, catching the beam of the flashlight, were amber, clear and direct and completely without fear. He did not growl. He did not flinch. He looked at Caleb the way a person looks at someone they have been waiting for and are relieved to finally see. "Hey," Caleb said. His voice came out softer than he intended. "How long have you been out here?" The dog didn't move. He watched. Caleb crouched down, one knee in the snow, and held out his gloved hand, palm up. Standard approach. Give the animal the choice. Don't force the contact. He had learned that from his father, who had spent 4 years working canine before Caleb was old enough to understand what that meant. The dog sniffed his hand. Then, slowly, with the deliberate economy of movement that Caleb would come to associate with everything this animal did, he stood up and walked to the cruiser's back door and waited. Caleb stared at him. "You want in?" he said. The dog looked at the door handle. Caleb opened it. The dog got in without being lifted, without hesitation, without the uncertain scramble of a stray encountering an unfamiliar vehicle. He stepped up, turned once, and lay down on the back seat with his chin on his paws and his amber eyes on Caleb's face in the rear-view mirror. Like he had done this 100 times before. Caleb sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. His radio crackled softly. The snow tapped against the windshield. "Okay," he said quietly, to the mirror, to the dog, to neither of them in particular. "Okay." He drove to Dr. Paula Venn's clinic on the east side of Fort Ridgeway. Paula was the only vet in town who kept emergency hours and answered her phone at 11 at night without making you feel like you had committed a crime. She met him at the back entrance in a coat pulled over her pajamas, glasses not quite straight, and she took one look at the dog and said, "Get him inside." She worked for 40 minutes. Caleb sat in the waiting area with his jacket still on and his hands between his knees and tried not to think too hard about the way the dog had looked at him on the highway. That steady, patient look. Like recognition. Paula came out wiping her hands on a towel. Severe dehydration, early hypothermia. He's underweight by about 12% for his frame and build. She paused. He's been out there at least 2 days, probably more. Will he make it? He'll make it. She looked at her notes. No chip, no collar, no registration in any database I can access tonight. She looked up. Caleb, this dog has been trained, professionally. However had him before knew exactly what they were doing. Caleb looked at the door to the exam room. What kind of training? The kind that costs money and takes years, she said. He let me do the full exam without restraint. No sedation. He followed every positioning command I gave him. He watched my hands the whole time, not my face. That's not a pet. That's a working dog. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Can I take him tonight? Paula looked at him over her glasses. You just found him on the highway. I know. You're not licensed for a canine unit independently. I know that too. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back into the exam room and came out with the dog on a borrowed lead. The dog walked to Caleb's side and sat. Not in front of him, not behind him, directly at his left heel. Paula watched. Like I said, she said quietly. Working dog. Caleb drove home with the dog in the back seat. His apartment was on the second floor of a building on Cedar Street. 2 bedrooms he used as one, a kitchen he used as a desk, and walls that were bare except for one thing: the photograph. It had been on the wall since the day he moved in. He hadn't hung it because he wanted to look at it. He had hung it because taking it down felt like an admission he wasn't ready to make. His father, Officer Daniel Hart, in full uniform outside the Fort Ridgeway precinct on a summer afternoon. One hand resting on the shoulder of a German shepherd with a black and tan coat and amber eyes so clear they came through even in a 6-year-old print. His father was smiling. He smiled easily, his father. That had always been the thing Caleb remembered most. How easy the smile came. Beneath the photograph, in his mother's handwriting on a strip of white tape she had put there when she framed it, Danny and Kane, Unit 4, Fort Ridgeway PD. Caleb set the borrowed lead down inside the front door and unclipped it from the dog's collar ring. You can go wherever, he said. I'll get you water. He went to the kitchen. He heard the dog's nails on the hardwood floor, moving through the apartment, the soft exploration of an animal taking inventory of a new space. He filled a bowl and carried it to the living room. The dog was standing in front of the photograph. Caleb set the bowl down. The dog did not turn around. He stood with his head slightly raised, his body completely still, his eyes on the image of Daniel Hart and the German shepherd named Kane. His ears were forward, his tail was low, not tucked, just low, the way a dog holds itself when it is concentrating on something that matters. Hey, Caleb said. Water's here. The dog did not move. Caleb took 2 slow steps toward him. The dog's posture didn't change. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the photograph, and specifically, Caleb realized, not on the image of his father. On Kane. On the dog in the image. On the animal standing beside Daniel Hart, with the same black and tan coat and the same amber eyes that were looking back at the photograph right now from 5 feet away. Then the dog barked. One single bark, sharp and clear. The kind of bark that has intention behind it. Not alarm, not fear. The bark of a trained dog making a deliberate communication. Then silence. Then he barked again. Caleb stood completely still. His chest had gone tight in a way he couldn't explain and didn't want to try. The dog turned and looked at him, those amber eyes moving from the photograph to Caleb's face. and the look held something that Caleb had no rational framework for, and no interest in dismissing. "You recognize him," Caleb said. His voice came out low and unsteady. The dog walked to the base of the wall and sat directly beneath the photograph. He put his chin down on his front paws and looked up at the image of Cain. He did not look away. Caleb sat down on the couch across from him. The apartment was quiet. Outside the window, the snow was still falling, and the wind was doing what Montana wind does in February, finding every gap and making itself known. He looked at the dog sitting beneath his father's photograph. He looked at Cain in the image, frozen at whatever age he had been in that summer 6 years ago, the last summer Daniel Hart was alive. He thought about what Paula had said. Working dog, professionally trained, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He thought about the way the dog had walked to the cruiser door and waited, the way he had stood at Caleb's left heel in the clinic without being placed there. He thought about his father's accident on a February road 6 years ago. Black ice, the report said. No witnesses, no investigation beyond the standard protocol for a single vehicle fatality on a mountain highway. Caleb had read that report once, 2 weeks after the funeral, and then he had put it in a drawer and not opened the drawer since, because grief had filled every available space and there was nothing left over for questions. He looked at the dog. The dog was still looking at Cain. "Who had you?" Caleb said softly. "Before the highway. Who trained you like that and then left you out there in the snow?" The dog's ear twitched. He did not look away from the photograph. Caleb leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and thought about his father's easy smile and the way the badge had looked on his chest, and the fact that 6 years had gone by and nobody in Fort Ridgeway had ever once come to Caleb and said there was anything about Daniel Hart's death that needed a second look. Nobody had said it. Caleb had never asked. He reached forward and picked up the dog's borrowed lead from the floor and turned it in his hands. He needed a name. He thought about the way the dog had appeared out of the dark and the snow on that highway median. The way he had simply been there, waiting, already knowing which car to get into. "Ghost," Caleb said. The dog's head came up. His amber eyes moved from the photograph to Caleb's face. Steady, clear, certain. Caleb held that gaze for a long moment. Outside the window, Fort Ridgeway was quiet under its February snow. The same town it had always been. The same streets and the same precinct, and the same mountain roads that wound up into the dark. He was going to start asking questions. He had the feeling, sitting across from those amber eyes in his bare apartment with his father's photograph on the wall, that Ghost had been waiting in the snow on Highway 9, specifically for him to be ready to do that. Ghost slept at the foot of the bed that first night, which was not something Caleb had planned or invited. He had set up the borrowed clinic blanket in the living room near the couch and said, "There," in a tone that was meant to communicate finality. And Ghost had looked at the blanket and then looked at Caleb, and then followed him to the bedroom and lay down at the foot of the bed with the settled certainty of a dog who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. Caleb lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to Ghost breathe. He told himself he would start with the databases in the morning, run Ghost's description through every system he had access to, check the regional canine registry, contact the state training program, file a found animal report through the county shelter network. Standard procedure, methodical, the kind of thing you did when you found a stray and wanted to do right by it. He told himself that. He did not entirely believe it, because what he kept coming back to, in the dark, with the dog breathing steadily at the foot of his bed, was the bark. That single deliberate bark in front of his father's photograph. The way Ghost had sat beneath it and put his chin on his paws and looked up at the image of Cain like he was paying respects to something. Caleb had been a police officer for 2 years. He believed in evidence. He believed in procedure. He believed in not constructing narratives from coincidence and emotional need. He also believed his father had not died on a patch of black ice on a February road because black ice was careless enough to kill Daniel Hart. He had believed that quietly, in the back of his mind, for 6 years. He had never said it out loud to anyone. He said it out loud now, in the dark, to no one, just to hear what it sounded like. He didn't just slide off that road. Ghost's breathing didn't change, but his head came up. In the dark, Caleb could see the faint amber gleam of his eyes. "I know," Caleb said. "I know." He didn't sleep much after that. By 7 the next morning, he was at his desk in the precinct, with Ghost at his left heel, which was where Ghost placed himself every time Caleb stopped moving. Left heel, precisely positioned, weight distributed evenly. A working dog, defaulting to the one position that had been drilled into him so many times it had become instinct. Every officer who walked past stopped and looked. 2 of them asked whose dog it was. Caleb said he was running registration checks on a found animal. Deputy Sheriff Lena Marsh stopped in the doorway of his office and did not ask anything. She looked at Ghost for a long time, with an expression Caleb couldn't fully read, and then she looked at Caleb. "Where did you find him?" she said. "Highway 9 median, last night, around 11. Lena's eyes went back to Ghost. "What breed assessment did the vet give?" "German Shepherd, adult male, approximately 4 to 5 years old. Full working dog behavioral profile." Lena was quiet for a moment. She had been on the Fort Ridgeway force for 15 years. She had known Daniel Hart. She had been at the funeral, one of the officers in dress uniform standing in the row behind Caleb's mother. And Caleb remembered seeing her face that day, the particular expression of someone carrying something they could not put down in a public place. "Run your checks," she said. "Let me know what you find." She started to turn away and then stopped. "Caleb." "Yeah?" She looked at Ghost one more time. "What's his name?" "Ghost." Something moved across her face. She nodded once and walked away. The database checks took 3 hours and produced nothing. No chip registration. No matching found dog reports filed in the last 30 days across 5 counties. No record in the state canine training program's active or retired roster that matched Ghost's physical description and estimated age. Caleb called the regional training center in Billings and spoke to a coordinator who was polite and thorough, and confirmed that no dog matching Ghost's profile had been registered, transferred, or decommissioned through their system in the last 5 years. "Is it possible a privately trained dog wouldn't show up in your records?" Caleb asked. "If the training was done through a private contractor who didn't register with the state program, yes," the coordinator said. "It's not common for working dogs at this level, but it's possible." "What level?" "The behaviors you're describing, handler side positioning, command compliance without verbal cues, sustained attention under distraction. That's advanced placement training. That's 12 to 18 months of professional work minimum." Caleb looked at Ghost, who was sitting at his left heel, watching the phone with the focused attention he brought to everything. "Someone put serious time and money into this dog," Caleb said, "and then lost track of him on a highway median in February," the coordinator said. There was a pause. "That doesn't happen by accident, officer." Caleb thanked her and ended the call. He sat for a moment. Then he said quietly, mostly to himself, "No, it doesn't." Ghost put his chin on the edge of the desk. That afternoon, on his lunch break, Caleb drove to his father's storage unit on the south end of town. He had been there twice since Daniel died, once to sort through the personal items, and once to retrieve a box of tools his mother had asked for. He had not gone back, because there was nothing there he needed, and everything there he was not ready to look at. He unlocked the roll door and pulled it up. Ghost walked in beside him without being invited and began moving along the perimeter of the unit, nose working, taking slow, deliberate inventory of the air in the space. Caleb went to the back corner, where 3 boxes of uniform gear were stacked beside a metal cabinet he had never opened. He had the key on his keyring. He had carried it for 2 years without knowing which lock it fit, only that it had been on the hook by his father's back door when Caleb cleared out the house, and he hadn't been able to throw it away. He tried the cabinet. The key turned. Inside, a field journal. Spiral-bound, the kind his father had always carried in his breast pocket. Dark green cover, with a crease across the front from years of being folded into a uniform pocket. The name Heart was written on the inside cover in black marker. Caleb's hands were not entirely steady when he opened it. The entry started 14 months before his father's death. Most were case notes, administrative observations, the ordinary documentation of a working patrol officer. But 4 months before the end, the tone changed. The entries became shorter, more careful, more coded. K9 budget line, 3rd quarter. Numbers don't match allocation. Checked twice. Spoke to Lena. She said leave it. I can't leave it. Requisition forms going directly to HC. No secondary review. Why? Someone redirected the contractor account. I need the original transfer authorization. HC. Caleb read those 2 letters 3 times. He thought about every senior officer in the Fort Ridgeway department, whose initials those could be. There was only one that fit. Raymond Holt, Chief of Police. Silver-haired, well-liked, 3 years from retirement. The man who had shaken Caleb's hand on his first day and told him his father had been a fine officer and that Fort Ridgeway was lucky to have another Heart on the force. Ghost appeared at Caleb's elbow. He pressed his nose against the open page of the journal and inhaled deeply, his eyes closing briefly, the way a dog's eyes close when a scent connects to something stored deep in its memory. Then he looked up at Caleb. You knew him, Caleb said. You were around him. Ghost held his gaze. Caleb turned to the last written page of the journal. His father's handwriting, always neat and consistent, had changed in the final entry. It was written faster, the letters pressing harder into the page. If anything happens before I can get this to the State Bureau, the authorization form is with L. She doesn't know what it means yet. Tell her to look at the contractor account number. Tell her HC signed it directly. Tell her Kane saw it too. Kane always knew. And then, below that, his father's last 3 words before the journal ended. Tell Caleb everything. Caleb closed the journal. He sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit with his back against the metal cabinet and the journal in his hands, and he did not move for a long time. Ghost walked over and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he stayed there without moving, the way a partner stays when they understand that what just happened requires a witness and not a solution. Caleb thought about his father writing that last entry. He thought about what it meant that Daniel Hart had specifically written his son's name, not as an afterthought, as a destination. He had known the information needed to travel somewhere, and he had known exactly where. He thought about Kane being decommissioned the week after the funeral. Behavioral issues, the department record said. He had accepted that without question because he was 20 years old and grief destroyed, and it had not occurred to him that a canine being removed from service immediately after its handler died was anything other than standard procedure. He thought about Ghost, standing beneath the photograph in his apartment at midnight, barking once at the image of a dog who had been decommissioned 6 years ago for knowing something. Kane always knew. Caleb stood up. He put the journal inside his jacket against his chest. He looked at Ghost. "Lena," he said. "We need to go talk to Lena." Ghost was already moving toward the door. They drove back to the precinct with the heater running and the radio off. Caleb kept his hand on the journal through his jacket the whole drive, feeling the hard edge of the spiral binding, the weight of his father's handwriting pressed into those pages. 14 months of quiet documentation. 4 months of something that looked a lot like fear, from a man Caleb had never once seen afraid. Lena Marsh was still at her desk when they came back in. She looked up when Ghost walked through the door, and something in her face shifted in a way that was too fast to catch and too real to dismiss. Caleb closed her office door. He put the journal on her desk. She looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then she looked at Caleb. "Where did you find this?" "Storage unit, locked cabinet." He paused. "The last entry. He mentions you." Lena's jaw tightened. She opened the journal to the last page and read it. Her expression didn't collapse the way some people's expressions collapse when they read something that confirms what they have been afraid of for a long time. She just went very still. "He came to me 3 weeks before he died," she said. Her voice was steady but quiet. "He gave me a document, a transfer authorization form. He said keep it somewhere safe and don't tell anyone you have it. He said he would come back for it when he had the rest." She looked up. "He never came back." "Do you still have it?" "I've had it for 6 years." She held his gaze. "I didn't know what to do with it. He was gone. The investigation was closed. I was afraid." She paused. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I am sorry for all 6 years of that." Caleb looked at the journal. He thought about the easiness of his father's smile and what it must have cost that man to keep smiling through 4 months of knowing what he knew and documenting it quietly in a notebook and leaving instructions for his son in the last line of the last page. "Get the document," Caleb said. "We're going to the State Bureau tonight." Lena was already opening her locker. Ghost sat at Caleb's left heel and did not move, his amber eyes on the door, watching the space between what had been buried for 6 years and what was about to happen next. Lena's locker was at the far end of the deputy's room, a narrow metal cabinet she had used for 15 years and never once left unlocked. She worked the combination with the practiced speed of someone who had opened it 10,000 times. But her hands, Caleb noticed, were not entirely steady. The document was in a sealed envelope taped to the inside back wall behind her spare uniform jacket. She had to peel the tape away carefully, the adhesive gone brittle from years against the cold metal. She held the envelope out to Caleb without opening it. "I never read it," she said. "He told me not to. He said the less I knew about the contents, the safer I would be." She paused. I believed him. Caleb opened it. Inside was a single page, a fund transfer authorization form, official Fort Ridgeway PD letterhead, dated 16 months before his father's death. The form redirected $42,000 from the K-9 training and equipment budget to a private contractor account with a routing number and a business name, Coldridge Field Services, LLC. At the bottom of the form, in the signature block reserved for senior departmental authorization, was Raymond Holt's signature. Caleb read it twice. Then he looked up at Lena. "Did you ever look up Coldridge Field Services?" he said. "I told you I never read it." "I'm not asking about the form," he said. "I'm asking if in 6 years, at any point, the name Coldridge ever came up in anything you handled." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Once," she said slowly. "About 8 months after Daniel died. There was a vendor dispute filed through the department's administrative office, a billing discrepancy on a training equipment order. The vendor name on the dispute was Coldridge. She stopped. Holt closed it personally. Same week it was filed. I thought it was routine. Caleb looked at the routing number on the form. He pulled out his phone and opened the State Business Registry database. He typed in Coldridge Field Services, LLC, and waited. No results. He tried the county registry. Nothing. He tried the federal contractor database. Nothing. He lowered his phone and looked at Lena. "It doesn't exist," he said. "There is no Coldridge Field Services. The account it transferred to is a ghost account." He let that sit for a second. $42,000. And that's just this one form. My father wrote about a pattern. Third quarter numbers that didn't match allocation. That means this wasn't one transfer. Lena sat down on the bench beside the lockers. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and looked at the floor for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were direct and a little tired. And something else. Something that looked like 6 years of held breath, finally releasing. "How much are we talking about total?" she said. "I don't know yet," Caleb said. "But my father spent 4 months documenting it, and he thought it was serious enough to hide a journal in a locked cabinet and leave you a document and write his son's name in the last line of the last page." He paused. That's not a man who thought he'd found a minor accounting error. Ghost had been sitting at Caleb's heel through the entire conversation. He shifted now, his weight moving forward slightly, his ears orienting toward the hallway door. Caleb put a hand briefly on his back without looking down. "We can't go through the department," Caleb said. "If Holt is running this, anything we file internally goes across his desk." "I know," Lena said. "State Bureau, tonight. We go directly to the Criminal Investigation Division and we file a formal report with the journal and the authorization form as supporting documents." He looked at her. "You're the senior officer on this. Your name goes on the report. Mine goes below yours." Lena looked at him for a moment. "You're 25 years old," she said. "You've been on the job for 2 years. If this goes wrong, your career is over before it starts." "If this goes right," Caleb said, "my father's career gets the ending it was supposed to have." She stood up. She straightened her jacket. She nodded once, short and definite, the nod of a woman who had been waiting to do the right thing for 6 years and was done waiting. "I'll drive," she said. They were 20 minutes out of Fort Ridgeway on the state highway when Caleb's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. "Officer Hart?" The voice was calm and even and immediately recognizable. Raymond Holt. "I heard you spent some time at your father's storage unit this afternoon." Caleb felt the cold move through him in a single wave and then settle into something harder. He kept his voice flat. "Chief, I also heard you paid a visit to Deputy Marsh after your shift." A pause. "Funny thing about small towns, word travels." Another pause, and this one was longer, deliberate, shaped like a warning. "Whatever you think you found, son, I want you to think very carefully about what you do with it. Your father thought he found something too. Look how that went." The line went dead. Caleb lowered the phone. Lena had heard enough from the driver's seat. Her jaw was set and her eyes were on the road, and she said one word. Accelerating. She pressed the gas. Ghost, in the back seat, put both front paws on the center console and leaned forward, his amber eyes on the road ahead, his body rigid and alert. The Montana Criminal Investigation Division field office in Billings was staffed overnight by a skeleton crew. But the agent who met them in the lobby at 10:47 that night was anything but skeletal in her approach. Special Agent Denise Calloway, mid-40s, steel-rimmed glasses. The kind of organized precision in her movements that told you she had been doing this long enough to recognize something real the moment it walked through her door. She took them to a conference room, and she listened without interrupting. Caleb laid the journal on the table. Lena laid the authorization form beside it. Caleb walked Calloway through the timeline, the entries, the pattern his father had identified, the ghost contractor account, the decommissioning of Kane the week after the funeral, and finally, the phone call they had received 20 minutes outside Fort Ridgeway from Chief Raymond Holt. Calloway read the journal's final entry twice. She looked at the authorization form once, and then pulled it closer and looked at it again. "How long have you had the authorization form?" she said to Lena. 6 years, Lena said. "Daniel Hart gave it to me 3 weeks before he died, and you've held it the entire time." "Yes." Calloway looked at her steadily. "Why tonight?" Lena glanced at Ghost, who was sitting at Caleb's heel beside the conference table. "Because the right person finally asked the right questions," she said. Calloway leaned back in her chair. The phone call from Holt. He said, "Look how that went," in reference to Daniel Hart. "Yes," Caleb said. "That's not a warning. That's a confession of knowledge." She tapped her pen on the table twice. "We cannot prove at this point that Holt caused your father's accident. What we can do is open a formal financial crimes investigation on the basis of this authorization form, and use that investigation to pull every budget record this department has generated in the last 5 years." She paused. "If the pattern your father identified is real, and if it ran as long as we think it ran, the numbers will tell the story themselves." "How long does that take?" Caleb said. "To open the investigation? 24 hours. To execute the financial audit? 6 to 8 weeks. She looked at him. "I know that's not what you want to hear." "What I want to hear," Caleb said, "is that Holt doesn't have 6 weeks to make things disappear." Calloway picked up her phone. "He won't," she said, and the way she said it told Caleb the call she was making was not going to wait until morning. They drove back to Fort Ridgeway at midnight. Lena was quiet most of the drive. Ghost had moved to the back seat and lay stretched along it, his head on his paws, his eyes tracking the dark road through the rear window. 10 miles out, Lena spoke. "He knew," she said, not a question. "Yes." "He knew your father was getting close, and he let him keep working, kept him close enough to watch, and then when Daniel had enough to be dangerous, he—" She stopped. "Yeah," Caleb said. "And Kane." Her voice was careful. "The decommissioning, behavioral issues. Kane was a working dog who had been with my father every day for 4 years, Caleb said. He would have documented field incidents in his behavioral record. Every canine does. Anything Daniel flagged during patrol, any evidence of the operation he was tracking, Kane's record would have corroborated it." He paused. Holt decommissioned him to eliminate the documentation. Lena gripped the wheel. "Where did Kane go after decommissioning?" "That's what I need to find out next," Caleb said. He looked back at Ghost. "Someone placed this dog. Someone knew him, trained him at a professional level, and then put him on a highway median in February. Either they were trying to get rid of him, or they were trying to get him found." Ghost raised his head from his paws and looked at Caleb across the back seat. Those amber eyes in the dark, steady as they had been from the first moment on the highway median. Patient, certain, holding something Caleb was still working toward understanding. "The coordinator in Billings said it doesn't happen by accident," Caleb said quietly. "A dog at this level ending up on a highway in the snow." "No," Lena said, "it doesn't." They came back into Fort Ridgeway on the main road, and the town was quiet and dark and looked exactly like it always had. Same streets, same buildings, same precinct at the corner of Main and 4th, where Daniel Hart had worked for 11 years, and Raymond Holt had run the show for 6. Caleb looked at the precinct as they drove past. The lights were still on in the chief's office on the second floor. Holt was still there, at midnight, waiting to see what came back from the drive to Billings. "Don't stop," Caleb said. Lena drove past without slowing. Caleb's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, different from the one Holt had called from. 3 words only. "Check Kane's file." He showed it to Lena at the next light. She read it. Her face did not change. "Someone inside the department," she said. "Someone who's been waiting too," Caleb said. Ghost put his chin on the back of Caleb's seat, close enough that Caleb could feel the warmth of the dog against his shoulder. He did not look at the phone. He looked ahead, through the windshield, at the dark road running forward through Fort Ridgeway, toward whatever the file on a decommissioned canine was about to tell them. Caleb put the phone in his pocket. "Kane's file," he said. "First thing in the morning." Kane's personnel file was 6 pages long and told almost nothing. Caleb pulled it from the department record system at 7 the next morning, before anyone else came in, printed it, and read it at his desk with Ghost at his heel and a cup of coffee he forgot to drink, going cold beside the keyboard. The file documented Kane's service record, his training certifications, his evaluation scores across 4 years of active duty, all of which were exceptional. And then, at the end, a single administrative notation dated 1 week after Daniel Hart's funeral. K9 Unit Kane, Badge 7, retired from active service. Reason? Behavioral deterioration following handler fatality. Placed per standard decommission protocol. Authorization? Chief R. Holt. That was it. No placement record, no transfer documentation, no receiving facility name, no follow-up evaluation, just placed per standard decommission protocol. As if a highly trained working dog, with 4 years of documented exceptional performance, had simply been filed away into a category called standard and left there. Caleb read the line 3 times. There was no standard protocol for placing a decommissioned canine without a receiving record. He knew that. Every animal processed through a department had to have a destination on paper. A shelter, a rescue organization, a private handler, a training facility. The paper trail was not optional. It was required. Someone had removed Kane's destination from this file. He picked up his phone and called Calloway at the State Bureau. She answered on the second ring. "Hart, Kane's decommission file has no placement record," he said. "Someone pulled it." A pause. "When?" "I don't know. The file was last accessed 14 months ago, according to the system log. But the modification timestamp on the placement field is 6 years old. It was removed within 30 days of Kane being taken out of service." "So Holt cleaned the file almost immediately," Calloway said. "That's what it looks like." "All right, I'm pulling Holt's system access log from the department's admin server. If he modified that record himself, his credentials will be on it." She paused. "Caleb, don't go into his office today. Don't give him a reason to act before we're ready." "Understood." He ended the call and looked at Ghost. "Someone still sent that text last night," he said. "Someone inside this building knows where Kane went." Ghost's ears moved forward. The text had come from an unknown number. No name, no context, just 3 words, and the certainty that whoever sent them knew something they had been holding on to. Caleb had run the number through the department's reverse lookup before he left the night before. The phone was registered to a prepaid carrier, untraceable the normal way. But whoever sent it had used the word check, not find or look for. Check implied the information was already somewhere accessible, already in a system, already on record somewhere that Caleb hadn't looked yet. He went to Paula Venn's clinic at 8:15. Paula was between early appointments when he came in, Ghost at his heel. And she took one look at Caleb's face and said, "Sit down. You look like you haven't slept." "I need to ask you something," he said. "When you assessed Ghost last night, you said he'd been professionally trained." "Yes." "Is there any way to determine from a dog's training profile who trained them? A specific methodology, a school, a private contractor?" Paula sat on the edge of her desk and crossed her arms. "Sometimes. High-level working dogs often have conditioning patterns that are specific to their program. Particular response sequences, specific reward reinforcement timing, hand signal variants." She studied Ghost. "I noticed something when I was examining him last night that I didn't mention, because I wasn't sure it was relevant." Caleb waited. "His grip response on the exam table," she said. "When I checked his jaw alignment, he held a specific bite inhibition position that I have only seen in dogs trained through one program, the Montana Law Enforcement Canine Collaborative. It's a private training contractor that works exclusively with law enforcement agencies." She paused. "They were the training provider for Fort Ridgeway PD's K-9 unit until about 6 years ago." Caleb felt the room tilt slightly. Until 6 years ago. "The contract ended. I remember because Dr. Ellis, who handled the department's canine veterinary care at the time, mentioned they had lost the contract suddenly. No explanation given." She looked at Ghost. If this dog was trained through the collaborative, he would have been placed into service through Fort Ridgeway PD. "Or placed out of it," Caleb said. Paula was quiet for a moment. "You think he was Kane?" The word landed between them, and neither of them moved. Caleb looked at Ghost. Ghost looked back at him, with those amber eyes that had been steady since the first moment on the highway median. Steady under the exam lights. Steady in the precinct. Steady beneath the photograph on his apartment wall. "The file says Kane was 4 years old when he was decommissioned," Caleb said. "Paula, how old did you estimate Ghost to be?" Paula looked at Ghost for a long moment. Her expression was careful and professional, and underneath it, something that was not either of those things. "I said 4 to 5, she said. "But given his muscle development and joint condition, the lower end of that range is more consistent." She stopped. 4 years old. 6 years ago would make him 10 now. Ghost's skeletal profile is consistent with a 10-year-old animal. "What about the coat?" Caleb said. "Kane had a black and tan pattern. Ghost has that same pattern." "German Shepherd coat coloring can shift with age," Paula said. "The deep black fades, the tan brightens. Over 6 years, a dog's coat can change considerably." She stepped forward and knelt beside Ghost, running her hands along his neck and shoulders, checking something specific. "There's also this." She parted the fur at the back of Ghost's left ear. A small area of scarring, healed over, the fur growing back thinner over it. "That's consistent with a microchip removal. Someone took his chip out." The silence in the room lasted about 4 seconds. "Someone removed his identification," Caleb said. "Yes. But kept him alive, trained him, and then put him on a highway median where he would be found by a patrol officer?" Paula stood. "Caleb, if this is Kane, if someone kept him for 6 years and then specifically placed him where you would find him, they were sending you something." His phone buzzed. A text from Lena. "Holt called an all-staff meeting, 9 a.m. Get back here now." He was back at the precinct in 8 minutes. The all-staff meeting was in the main briefing room, which seated every officer on the Fort Ridgeway force with room left over. Holt stood at the front in full uniform, silver hair combed, badge polished, the picture of a chief in complete command of his department and his morning. He looked at Caleb when Caleb came in. The look lasted 1 second and conveyed everything it needed to. "I've called everyone in," Holt said, "because I want to address something directly. There's been some activity in the last 24 hours that I want to clear up before it becomes a distraction." He kept his tone measured and collegial, the tone of a reasonable man managing a minor misunderstanding. "Officer Hart has been looking into some old administrative records related to his father's service. I understand the impulse. Grief takes different shapes. But I want to be clear that the department's financial records have been audited annually and are fully compliant. And I want to ask Officer Hart directly, in front of this team, to bring any concerns he has to me personally, rather than taking them outside the department." Every officer in the room was looking at Caleb. Caleb stood at the back, with Ghost at his heel, and said nothing. He held Holt's gaze and said absolutely nothing, and let the silence do the work that words would have wasted. Holt waited. When nothing came, he nodded once and said, "Good. That's all." People began to stand. Lena caught Caleb's eye from across the room and gave the smallest possible shake of her head. "Not here. Not yet." Caleb was walking out when the officer beside him, a man named Garrett, who had been on the force for 12 years and had the quiet, careful energy of someone who watched more than he spoke, put a hand briefly on Caleb's arm and leaned close. "Storage facility on Route 7, Garrett said, very low, facing forward. "Unit 14. My name's on the lease. I've been holding something for 6 years, waiting for the right time." He moved away before Caleb could respond. Ghost pressed against Caleb's leg. That was the text. Garrett had sent the text. Caleb drove to Route 7 at noon on his lunch break with Ghost and Lena. Garrett met them there, arriving separately, checking twice that he hadn't been followed before he unlocked the storage unit and stepped back. Inside were boxes, organized, labeled, preserved in sealed plastic containers. Garrett stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and spoke without being asked. Kane's trainer at the collaborative was a woman named Ruth Ingram. When Kane was decommissioned, she refused to let him be euthanized. She took him privately, off the record, and placed him with a handler she trusted north of Missoula. He paused. Holt found out 8 months later. He pulled the collaborative's contract, told them it was budget-related, and then he told Ruth that if she ever discussed Kane's placement, he would see her prosecuted for theft of department property. He looked at Caleb. "Ruth called me 2 weeks ago. She said she was dying. Pancreatic cancer. She said she had held it long enough, and she wanted someone to finish what your father started." He nodded toward the boxes. "Everything in here your father gave to Ruth for safekeeping 18 months before he died. She's had it since." Lena walked to the nearest box and opened it. Inside were printed financial records, transfer authorizations, budget comparison documents, and a portable drive labeled in Daniel Hart's handwriting, "Coldridge, complete." Caleb picked up the drive. His father had finished the documentation. He had completed the entire case and handed it to someone he trusted outside the department. And then he had died on a February road before he could take it to the State Bureau himself. "Ruth Ingram," Caleb said. "Is she reachable?" "She's in Missoula General," Garrett said. "She doesn't have much time, but she'll talk to you. She said specifically she would talk to Daniel Hart's son." He paused. "And she said to tell you that Ghost is Kane. She placed him on that highway herself 2 weeks ago. She said she couldn't think of a better way to make sure the right person found him." Caleb looked at Ghost. Ghost sat at his heel, amber eyes on Caleb's face, steady and patient and carrying 6 years of everything that had needed carrying until the right moment arrived. Caleb crouched down in front of him. He put both hands on the dog's face, gently, the way you hold something you have been looking for, without knowing you were looking. "Hey, Kane," he said. The dog's tail moved once, slow and certain. That was enough. Caleb stood and picked up the drive and turned to Lena. "We need to get this to Callaway tonight," he said, "and tomorrow morning I need to be in Missoula." Lena was already on her phone. Garrett was watching Caleb with the expression of a man whose 6 years of quiet waiting had just found its purpose. Ghost stayed pressed against Caleb's side the whole drive back, warm and solid and present, the way a partner stays when they know the work is almost done and they intend to see it through to the last moment. Ruth Ingram was smaller than Caleb had imagined. He didn't know why he had imagined her any particular way. Garrett had described her as Kane's trainer, and Caleb's mind had built someone large and weathered and physically imposing, the way working dog trainers often were. But the woman in the hospital bed in Missoula General was slight and pale, and had hands that looked like they belonged to someone who had spent decades doing precise, careful work, which she had. She was 63 years old, and she looked like someone who had made peace with what was coming, and had one piece of unfinished business left. Ghost walked into the room at Caleb's heel, and Ruth Ingram's eyes filled immediately. She did not say anything for a moment. She watched Ghost cross the floor and approach the bed, and Ghost put his front paws on the bed rail with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and pressed his nose against Ruth's hand. She closed her fingers around his muzzle gently. "There he is," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. "There's my boy." Ghost made a sound Caleb had not heard from him before, low and quiet, somewhere between a whine and a sigh, the sound of a dog recognizing someone it loved and understanding that the time was short. Caleb sat in the chair beside the bed and waited. "He remembered you," he said, "after 6 years." "They always remember," Ruth said. "People think dogs forget. They don't. They just wait." She stroked Ghost's ear without looking away from him. "I called him Ghost when I placed him with the handler north of Missoula. Felt right. He was supposed to be gone, and he wasn't." She looked up at Caleb. "You look like your father." Caleb's chest tightened. "People say that." Daniel used to bring Kane in for evaluations when Kane was still a pup. He'd sit right there where you're sitting and ask questions the whole time. What was Kane learning? Was he progressing? What did I think his ceiling was? She paused. Daniel always said Kane's ceiling was higher than any dog he had ever worked with. He was right. She looked at Ghost. Kane's ceiling was high enough to carry a truth for 6 years and deliver it to the one person who could do something with it. Caleb leaned forward. "Ruth, the drive my father gave you. Calloway at the State Bureau has it. She executed a search warrant on Holt's departmental records this morning. But I need to know what you know, in your own words, for the official record. Can you do that?" "That's why I asked you to come," she said. She talked for 40 minutes. Caleb recorded it on his phone with her permission. She described the contract between the Montana Law Enforcement Canine Collaborative and the Fort Ridgeway PD, the payments that came through, the budget line they were drawn from, and the discrepancies she had noticed in the billing records 18 months before Daniel Hart died. She described Daniel coming to her, not at the precinct, at her home, in the evening, after dark, and asking her to hold the documents he had compiled because he didn't trust anywhere inside the department to be safe. She described Kane being decommissioned, Holt calling her personally to say the dog had exhibited behavioral instability following handler fatality and needed to be removed immediately. She described refusing. She described the argument. She described Holt's voice on the phone going from professional to something that was not professional at all when she told him she would not authorize an animal to be put down without a full behavioral assessment from an independent evaluator. "He backed off," she said. "He backed off because fighting me publicly would have raised questions. So he settled for pulling the contract and threatening me quietly, and making sure Kane's placement record disappeared from the file so nobody could trace where he went." "He assumed the trail ended there," Caleb said. "He assumed I was too afraid to do anything," she said. "For 6 years he was right." She looked at Ghost. "Then I got sick. and I realized afraid didn't mean what it used to mean. She met Caleb's eyes. I placed Kane on that highway because I knew the overnight patrol route. I knew which officer was running it. I had been watching you for 2 months, reading the Fort Ridgeway Courier, following the department news, waiting to see if you were who your father was. Caleb was quiet for a moment. How did you know I would stop? Ruth smiled, the first full smile she had given since they came in. Because you're Daniel Hart's son, she said simply. And because Kane would not have allowed you to drive past? Ghost put his chin on Ruth's hand and closed his eyes. She passed away 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, with a hospice nurse present and a written statement on file with Special Agent Calloway that was, in Calloway's words, the most complete first-hand account of departmental financial corruption she had processed in 19 years of investigative work. Caleb was in Fort Ridgeway when he got the call. He sat in his cruiser for a few minutes after hanging up with Ghost in the passenger seat beside him. He did not try to make himself feel anything other than what he felt, which was grief for a woman he had known for one afternoon, and gratitude so large it had no clean shape. She finished it, he said to Ghost. She held it for 6 years, and she finished it. Ghost put his paw on Caleb's arm. Raymond Holt was placed under formal arrest 12 days after Calloway's search warrant executed. The charges were extensive: financial fraud, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, abuse of authority, and one additional count that Calloway had added after reviewing the complete file on Daniel Hart's accident: criminal negligence in connection with the death of a law enforcement officer. The investigation could not prove direct causation beyond reasonable doubt for that final charge, and Calloway had told Caleb that honestly and without softening it. But it was on the record. Daniel Hart's name was on the charge sheet. That was not nothing. That was everything. Holt walked out of the Fort Ridgeway precinct in handcuffs on a Thursday afternoon. Caleb was not standing outside when it happened. He had been advised by Calloway to maintain distance from the arrest itself, and he had agreed. And he had driven to the east side of town and parked at the overlook above the valley, and sat there with Ghost until Lena texted him a single word. Done. He exhaled and put his forehead against the steering wheel for just a moment. 1 moment. Then he straightened. Ghost was watching him. Your dad would be relieved, Caleb said. Then he heard himself. He looked at Ghost. My dad. Sorry, I meant my dad. Ghost's tail moved. The suspension Caleb received for bypassing department chain of command lasted 4 days. It was lifted when Calloway submitted a formal commendation to the State Oversight Board, and the board issued a public statement supporting the action. Claire Odom, the journalist at the Fort Ridgeway Courier, who had covered the town for 20 years and had a file she had never published because the timing had never been right, published a 4-part series that ran across 2 weeks. The headline of the first piece was, Daniel Hart was right: How a Police Officer's Journal Brought Down a 6-Year Cover-Up. It sold out before noon. The second issue sold out by 10 in the morning. The third and fourth issues, Claire told Caleb, had to be reprinted twice each. People came to Caleb in the weeks that followed, the way people come when a truth they have been living alongside without naming finally gets named. A retired officer who had transferred out of Fort Ridgeway 9 years ago called to say he had always felt something was wrong with the department's financial reporting and had left rather than ask questions. A woman whose husband had filed an internal complaint that disappeared called to say thank you. A man who had worked with Daniel Hart in his first year on the force came to the precinct and asked to speak with Caleb privately, and spent 20 minutes telling him things about his father that Caleb had never known, stories about who Daniel Hart had been as an officer before the K-9 unit, before the documentation, before the 4 months of quiet, careful fear. Good things, real things. Caleb listened to every one of them. The formal commendation ceremony was held on a Friday afternoon in the Fort Ridgeway Town Hall, modest and direct, the way Lena Marsh ran everything now that she was interim chief. She stood at the podium, and she did not read from a prepared script. She spoke from what she knew. Daniel Hart spent 14 months documenting something that cost him his life, she said. He did it carefully and quietly, and he trusted the right people with the right pieces. And he left instructions for his son, because he believed the truth would eventually find its way to the person who could carry it forward. She paused. It did. It took 6 years and a German shepherd on a highway median, but it did. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something true is being said. Lena turned to Caleb. This department owes you, and it owes your father. The commendation on paper is the beginning of repaying that debt. The rest of the repayment is what we do from here. She handed him the certificate. He shook her hand and held it for a moment longer than protocol required, and she let him. Then she reached into the box on the podium and produced a second item. A collar medallion, dark metal, the Fort Ridgeway department seal on one face. She turned it over and showed him the inscription on the back, which she had requested personally and paid for herself. Kane, Unit 4. He never stopped. Ghost accepted the new collar with the patience of a dog who had learned long ago that humans needed ceremonies for the things that mattered. He sat straight while Lena fastened it, and he looked forward at the room with his amber eyes steady and calm and fully present. When Lena stepped back, the room applauded. Ghost did not react to the applause. He turned his head and looked at Caleb. After the ceremony, Caleb drove to the cemetery. It was late afternoon, the light coming low and golden, the way it comes in Montana in early spring, when the snow is finally starting to mean it. He stood at his father's grave with Ghost beside him, and he did not prepare what he was going to say, because he had learned from his father that the best things were said without preparation. "We got there," he said. "It took longer than it should have. Some of that is on me for not asking questions sooner." He paused. "Most of it is on a man who is currently waiting for a trial date, so I'll leave that where it belongs." He looked at Ghost. "Kane found me, or Ruth found me through Kane. Either way, you left the right things with the right people, and it held together." He stopped. "I'm going to do this job the way you did it. I'm going to ask the questions that need asking and document the things that need documenting, and trust the right people with the right pieces." He crouched down and put his hand on Ghost's back. "And I'm going to have a good partner." Ghost pressed into his hand. They stood there until the light changed, the two of them at the grave of the officer who had started this change 6 years ago and trusted it to travel far enough to land where it needed to land. Then Caleb straightened, and they walked back to the cruiser together. 3 weeks later, a formal letter arrived from the Montana Law Enforcement Canine Collaborative, reinstated as the department's official training provider following Holt's removal. The letter confirmed Ghost's registration as an active canine unit, Badge 7, Unit 4, Fort Ridgeway, PD. The badge number was not coincidental. Caleb had requested it specifically. He framed the registration certificate and hung it on the wall of his apartment, beside the photograph of Daniel and Kane. Ghost looked at the photograph the morning the certificate went up, the way he had looked at it on that first night, standing still, amber eyes on the image of his younger self, beside the man who had trained with him and trusted him and loved him. But this time he did not bark. He simply looked for a long, quiet moment. And then he walked to Caleb's left heel and sat, ready, present, certain. Caleb clipped his badge to his uniform, picked up his keys, and looked at the 2 photographs on the wall, the one 6 years old and the one 3 weeks old, his father and his father's dog, and himself and his father's dog. The circle closed, and the work continuing, and the truth finally spoken, and permanent in the record where truth belongs. Some loyalties do not expire when the body does. Some dogs carry what their handlers could not finish, not out of training, but out of the particular love that forms between a working animal and the person who trusted them completely. Cain carried 6 years of that love through a Montana winter and delivered it to the one door it was always meant to reach. Daniel Hart built his case in 14 months of careful silence and left it in the hands of people who would hold it until his son was ready to carry it forward. And Caleb Hart stopped on a highway median on a February night for a shape that might have been debris, because that was the job, and because some instincts run deeper than procedure, and because his father's voice was somewhere in him saying, "Stop, check, do not drive past what matters." He stopped. Ghost got in. The truth came home. That is not coincidence. That is what loyalty looks like when it refuses, absolutely refuses, to let the wrong thing be the last thing. Amen.